So let's take a closer look at the way that weed use impacts the brain and the body. But remember, our goal here isn't to convince anyone that weed is good or bad, and it's not even to convince you that you shouldn't do it. We don't assign morality to substance use. Instead, the goal of this section is to make sure you're approaching the topic with all the facts so that you can make the best decision for yourself. That said, as we talk about some of the not so good impacts of cannabis use, keep in mind that the only way to completely avoid risk is through abstinence. So, with that said, let's talk about use and risk. We're going to talk a bit about what impacts cannabis can have on the brain and body, but it's important to understand the role frequency of use plays in that and what contributes to the extent of risk you have to experience these impacts. Some are more genetically predisposed than others to experience the not so good impacts of weed, and some are more likely to experience it based off of how often they might use cannabis and how. Recreational use is considered less than weekly, whereas regular use is generally once to twice a week for a period of a few months or more. Heavy or acute use is several times a week for months or more. As you go down this spectrum, the impacts that we're going to be discussing will be more likely and possibly more severe. Frequency isn't the only factor to consider when trying to engage how likely someone is to experience the not so good impacts of cannabis and to what extent. There are all sorts of things to think about. For instance, it's not just how often edibles are taken, but what the THC content is or the potency as well. We also have to take into account things like personal genetic factors, health, and an individual's behaviors when intoxicated. All these factors intersect to create what is known as someone's risk level, and whether a person is low, moderate, or high risk depends on if and how they use, as well as how much and what that looks like in their own individual life. So, before we move on to the next main section, we're going to take 5 minutes to complete a survey that you'll see in the next slide.